Hello and welcome back to the live series podcast brought to you by Amicus. This is the podcast that brings you insight into the life and role of tech leaders from all over the world. And today I'm joined by Susan Reilly. Susan is the Senior Director of Engineering over at Typeform. Hi, Susan. How are you doing?
I'm good, Heather. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. I know I kind of messed up your introduction there because I actually kind of had in my head a comment that you just mentioned before we came on. I always double check with guests that I'm just double check like I'm pronouncing the names correctly and everything like that and getting the job titles right. And Susan actually did admit that she preferred to be called the one that is to be obeyed. So I kind of
Yep.
fluffed my opening there because I was just thinking, don't say it, don't say it. But I've said it now, so there we
There
go.
you have. Thanks
Absolutely.
for that, Heather.
No,
Yeah.
it's all right. I always love to drop my guests in it as soon as the episode starts. It's a good, it's a good starting point. But yeah, me and Susan chatted last week, briefly, and I don't think I've ever giggled so much, to be fair, on an introduction call. So, I've genuinely been excited to have this one, off the ground, and some of the topics that we're going to be covering in this episode are genuinely quite inspiring and something that's important to be speaking about. So, but before we get into any of that, Susan, just for anyone that's not really heard of you or any of your work, do you want to kind of maybe go over some of your experience up to now?
Oh God, how long do we have? As my kids would say back in the olden days. So my name is Susan. Obviously, you've already covered that, and I'm based in Dublin in Ireland. And I kind of fell into technology. It was accidental, totally accidental. Um, when I left school, like I do think we're very naive to say to an 18-year-old, hey, what do you want to do with the rest of your life, right? Um, because when you're younger you want to be a nurse or a firefighter or an astronaut, and I've never met a kid who goes, hey, I want to be a director of engineering when I grow up, right? Just doesn't happen. When I left school I had a offer for university to do Greek and philosophy. Imagine Greek and philosophy. And I kind of went, oh no, I'm a very sort of hands-on type person, and I had had enough of book learning. So my dad kind of said, okay, you can take the summer, then you need to figure out what you're going to do. And I still remember going to him saying, I figured out what I want to do with the rest of my life. I'm going to do a secretarial course, right? And my dad cracked up laughing and he's like, Sue, if you can tell me you know what you want to do for the rest of your life when you're 25, I'll be happy. But a secretarial course is a good start. So I started out my career as a secretary. I'm really good at speed typing, still have that skill, valuable skill. But when I met my now husband, then boyfriend, he was kind of like, what are you doing? You could do more. He's always been my biggest fan and my absolute champion. And as I mentioned, this is back in the olden days. So the internet had just arrived, and Alan, my husband, got me a router, which I plugged into the fax line in work. Oh my God, like I was so bold. And I worked for an estate agents, right? So they were trying to fax through offers and, oh, the line is busy, the line is busy. But I started looking at websites and I was really curious. And Alan again said to me, you can view the source by right-hand clicking. And I was like, oh, wow. So ended up doing a webmaster training course for 6 weeks. And that's kind of how I ended up in technology. I'm not going to give you a blow by blow. I will tell you, because I told you this last week, right? I used to leave jobs when I ran out of holidays. Because when you're young, right, there are two things that matter. One, your holidays, and one, how much they're paying you. So I had 11 jobs in 7 years. It's shocking. Yeah, I know. I used to use a lot of holidays, as you can gather. But I ended up kind of in a project management role. And I got a job in a company, and I really, really liked working for my, he was actually the VP of engineering at the time. But I'd been in the job for maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and an engineer came over to me one day and he said, I need to take Friday off. Is that okay? And I was looking at him going, I'm the project manager. Why? Yeah, sure. No problem. I don't mind. And then about 3 days later, another engineer came over and said, I have a dental appointment on Tuesday. I'm going to be late in. Is that okay? And I was like, what's happening here? So I went into my then boss and I was like, why are the engineers asking me about having time off? And he's like, oh yeah, I've just asked the 11 of them to report to you for the moment. And I was like, oh no, hang on. I'm a project manager, not a people manager. And he was like, no, Susan, I think you're really good, strong people skills, and you should be a manager. And I was like, no, 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 I'll do it for now. And he said, no, I have this whole idea, right? You're going to start as an engineering manager, then you're going to be a director. The world is your oyster after that. And I like to think I'm pretty smart and I'm quite strategic. And literally about a year and a half later, I turned around to my husband and went, oh my God, he's totally outmaneuvered me. And here I am, a director of engineering. Like, um, but he was right. Because I'm really passionate about people. And I love being in a role where I get to influence people's careers. Sorry, long-winded answer, Heather. Does that help?
Not at all. No, that's perfect. Like, I think it's such an interesting one to cover as well, because a lot of the time our guests have maybe got, computer science degrees and it's kind of always something that they've been into, or it's kind of been a hobby that's turned into a career, but
Mm,
to come out of nowhere and just kind of
yeah,
almost be thrown at you as a career. But because I kind of want to move on to like talking about empathy, to be fair. So it's really interesting that you said about you were kind of just handed it by your manager with no kind of consultation on it, no nothing. You were totally thrown in almost the deep end with it, and then after a year and a half, you were the director of engineering. Like that's kind of crazy. And would you say that's unheard of, or would you think that because it sounds obviously like you did very clearly have those skills and those were already in place, and it's just kind of been spotted within you, and you've been raised up to that level as a result. So,
yeah,
in terms of having, that kind of almost is like a state of empathy for those developers and those engineers who were coming to you for time off and things. They were like, right, well, they need somebody who can look after them properly and who can actually who they can report to and feel like fulfilled in that. But how do you think kind of empathy comes into it? Empathy comes into it as from like a kind of as a responsibility, because they're kind of almost juxtaposing kind of concepts, right? Where you kind of have
yeah.
lots of responsibility, but you also have to have plenty of empathy as a leader.
Yeah, and I think you really nailed it, right? That manager, that my then manager, right? He just had this innate ability to see like the how to bring out the best in people and to see where their skills actually lie. And it's very rare in a leader, right? And I think to be an effective leader, you have to know the people you're leading, right? So I have a mantra, and I share this with anyone who works with me. It is family first, health second, work third. Okay. Because we spend so much of our time in work losing sight of things that are actually important to us outside of the job. That's a rabbit hole you just don't want to go down. Um, and I also have another thing. If somebody comes to me and says they need time off, I trust my people. So I'm never going to ask for justification. And actually, somebody recently was saying, I'm going to be late for work tomorrow. And my response, fine. And they started to continue to tell me why. I was like, I don't need to know why, right? I trust you. If you tell me you need to take a couple of hours in the morning, that's fine. The job gets done, right? The job's not going to go anywhere. And it's also, and sounds terrible, right? But if I was hit by a bus in the morning, will Typeform crumble to a halt? No, of course it won't, right? Um, because as leaders, if we've done our jobs properly, we have people who will be able to just pick up the reins and keep the wheel turning. We're cogs, right? And so I think it's really important. One of the biggest things I think that is the most important thing to remember is be kind. Okay. It's actually really easy to be mean and to be a bitch, but actually being kind, you get what you give. So I try to lead by example. I think I'm a naturally empathetic person. I'm also a mother. So I understand what juggling work and, home life is like. Um, and as long as you can put yourself in another person's shoes and just try to understand what they're going through, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I love that as well. I think that whole kind of concept of this company won't crumble without me because I've done the best job of kind of bringing everyone else up to speed. And I
Mm.
think I love that as well because it's kind of that whole thing about even there's some examples of flexibility within working hours and things like that. I was kind of going to kind of talk about work-life balance a little bit because it is difficult for a leader, right? To kind of, I know you were saying there, it's much easier to just be a bit horrible to your team. Not horrible, but it's much easier to just have that instinctive reaction to something that might bother you or something, and then just take it out on that person directly. But having those emotions, need to kind of double check. I think there was I can't remember who it was now, but I had a guest on previously who kind of said like your initial reaction you can't help, but how you deal with it you can help. So you can
Yeah, I
kind
love
of
that.
your first thought is your first thought, and you can't do anything about that. But the way that you act on that thought is something that you can control, and I think that's so important in leadership. So when it comes to work-life balance with your team, is it currently a massive team? Like, how many people have you got on your team at the moment? How many, what you're juggling right now?
Should have done my research before this. So I currently work with 5 different teams, and they range in size from, I think the smallest has 5 engineers, and the biggest has a team of 10. So that there's probably maybe 35, 40. I should have done the maths first, sorry. But we've actually just done a reshuffle recently, so that's my excuse. The work-life balance thing, right? Typeform is brilliant for this. We're 100% remote. So we don't actually have a physical office anywhere. Everyone is working from home. And I think when people are working from home, there is natural flexibility within that, right? I can run out and throw a load of laundry in the washing machine in between meetings, right? I can cook dinner at lunchtime because my teenage boy is starving when he comes home, has to be fed immediately. But I mean, key to it is, I mentioned this already, right? Trust. You have to, I remember when COVID started and I was working in a different company, and there had been we had tried to introduce work from home Fridays. And there had been a lot of pushback from leadership who were concerned that, how do we know people will do the job, right? Because you're not there to kind of look over their shoulders. And I was trying to say, just because somebody is sitting at a computer in an office, it doesn't mean they're being productive. They may appear to be. So thinking that by mere virtue of having them sitting in an office in a physical space with you means that they're going to be productive, I think is naive, right? And again, it comes back to trust. You trust your people, you trust they'll get the job done. I used to say to people, I don't care where you're working from, but if you're in the bath right now, don't turn on your camera. As long as the job gets done, it really doesn't matter to me. And I think when you don't have that trust, people don't trust you in return, and they're not going to give you their best. So yeah, the flexibility as well, it's really important. Everyone has something, right? Whether it's an elderly parent, whether it's young children, whether it's their own kind of health issues that they need to take care of. And again, I think it comes back to, nobody's going to check I would never look at my watch in the morning to check what time people are walking in the door. Likewise, I would never look at my watch to check what time people are leaving, right? If they tell me the job is done or they're going to get it done, I trust and believe in them.
Yeah, hours don't always kind of accumulate any kind of work, do they? A lot of the time, like a job could take you 5 minutes and you can get it done, and it's all about the results, right? So I think
Exactly.
that's a really, really healthy outlook to have. And it's again something that comes up a lot on this podcast of kind of how to manage your team's expectations when it comes to your trust and your flexibility, and how you're going to kind of manage them in that way. Because I think there's a lot of people that might come into like a new role with a manager like yourself, or who has that kind of holistic view on things, and they're almost like they have some like past traumas from other managers, and they're like you said, like over explaining, needing a couple of hours out of the office, or just feeling like they need to overcompensate and over explain everything, and it's not a healthy thing to have to do at work, right? So you're not kind of explaining playing out for an extra 10 minutes with your friends when your mum's calling you in for dinner. It's work. Like it's we're adults and we can manage this. Like so I think that's that's a really great, excuse me, that's a great example. So in terms of kind of, I'm going to kind of merge a couple of things. So like
Sure.
in terms of best techniques to get the best out of your team, we've kind of covered a little bit of that there. Is there something that comes into when you're hiring new people for your team that you kind of look out for, like any kind of green flags and things that you kind of think, well, this person will work well, or this person seems trustworthy, or this person seems like they can manage the time well, or is it something completely different? And I mean more kind of from a cultural perspective or from a soft skills perspective as opposed to kind of technical skills. But yeah, is that something like when you inherit a team, you kind of get what you get, right? But when you're hiring, what on earth, where do you even start considering how to find the right person.
Yeah, goodness, you're really hitting me with the hard questions today. So yeah, I mean, there are two kind of distinct things, right? When you inherit a team. So when I joined Typeform in June 2022, my boss Gordon sent me a list of people he felt I should connect with, you know. And it was a really illustrious list, right? There was VP of this and director of that. And I was like, that's great. But actually, first of all, I'm going to talk to every engineer that's going to be working with me. Because as I said before, right, you need to know the people. And I said to Gordon, I'll get to your list, but my priority right now is to have a one-to-one with every single engineer. And I called it Susan's 3-step program. Because I measure my success on how successful my teams are. And I can't help a team to be successful unless I know what their challenges are. So I had an initial chat with each individual, and I basically asked them to do some homework, go away and think about how I could help make things better for them. And then the second step was to have the follow-up conversation. And then the third step was to collate all of that information, present it back to them in a group and kind of go, have I got this right? And then take those learnings and see how I could help to make things better. So that's how I approach inheriting a team. Interviewing is hard, right? Because anyone can be on their best behavior for, 1 hour and present the best version of themselves. And again, I think Typeform have a really good interview process, right? So it's not just you don't just meet a single person, right? So you start by meeting an engineering manager. So obviously talent acquisition first, then you meet an engineering manager whose team you will be working with. Then you meet some engineers from that team, you do a technical test, and all going well, I don't get involved. I don't need to get involved. My engineering managers are amazing. For higher roles or more advanced roles, more senior roles, obviously we do get involved. And it is hard because you're not always going to get it right. For me, communication is key, right? How a person communicates. They don't need to use big words, right? They don't need to use fancy language. It's basically, can they get their point across in a really good way? Typeform is made up of, I think we've got individuals from 27 different nationalities. So a lot of people, I know it's massive, right? A lot of people, English isn't their first language. So that's why I over-index on communication. And again, that's why the big words don't matter to me. Can you make yourself understood? Even if English isn't your native language or you are a native English speaker, but your audience is cultural mix. So communication for me is key. And I also, this is going to sound a little bit cheesy, but you do tend to get a vibe, right, from a person. And you do get that sort of, oh, I could work with this person. I think they'd be great. So, but you're not always going to get it right. And the most important thing is, Gordon, my boss, has a saying, fail fast. And I really like that, right? You can quite easily spot this person isn't going to fit. And sometimes, and this is the hard part of being a manager, right, is you're making decisions based on what's best for the team. So Heather, you could be working for me and I think you're brilliant and we have great crack and we go for lunch and you're a fabulous person, but you're not getting your job done, which means the other members of your team are having to work longer hours, pick up the slack. And so I have to make the tough call, right? On a personal level, you're an amazing person, but from a team perspective, you're not carrying your weight. And that's the rough part of management, right? It's when you're making decisions that impact people's lives, and not only their lives, but their livelihood. But the responsibility lies with the team as a whole. We also have a phrase, right? Team player even over star player. And that's what we look for, team players.
Yeah, I love that. Whew, I've never been sacked from a fictional job before on a podcast. I really felt that.
Sorry.
That's
It was great working with you. And I wish
yeah, it was great. Let's just cut this short now. That's it. We're done. I'm done. I'll get my things. No, that's honestly, like, I really love your attitude towards it, because you're totally right. You can't expect your team to pick up the slack for a new hire, like, and it does happen, and it is such a massive shame. Especially, it makes it so much harder when the person's really sound. But yeah, it does make a lot of sense. And I think you're right about the vibe as well. Like it comes up again, it comes up a fair bit. And there's a lot of people that say you just got to listen to your gut sometimes when you meet somebody. And it's
Yeah.
kind of difficult to, I think, when you're hiring, you kind of think, well, am I just wanting to hire this person because I think they're good and I think I will personally be able to work well with them? Or do I think that the team will be able to work really well with them? Or, you don't want to just kind of suddenly create a clique because you just like somebody and or they support the same football team as you or something like that, for example. It's like,
Yeah.
but sometimes you do have to kind of really strike that balance of what's a kind of bias, but it's like a healthy bias because you know that they're going to work well with you. And if they can kind of vibe, especially when it's remote, like I suppose that's kind of more important because this
Mhm.
person's not just gonna, the communication's already got a lot of barriers in a remote situation anyway. So
Yes.
you really, really need that to kind of fit right. But again, like you said earlier, you need to also trust them to do the work. So it doesn't matter how sound they are if they're not doing the work. It's fully
That's the
remote
problem.
as
Yeah.
well, so that you literally, have you ever had, not to put you on the spot in terms of throwing people under the bus for who you've worked with, but have you ever had like, kind of people come to you or an example of where like we kind of said like this new hire's not working, or have you ever kind of made a decision off of the back of what a team's kind of said to you?
Yeah.
And has it ever been something that you've not noticed yourself, and has it been brought to your attention?
So I think that the most recent time this happened to me, I was kind of conscious of the fact that, this particular individual wasn't delivering what I expected. Now, the team always delivered, but you'd see people's names or people would talk you through what they have done. And there just seemed to be a lack of information coming from this person. And I did speak to the engineering manager who said, yeah, it's not good at the moment. Now there was a lot of personal stuff happening with this person, so you make allowances. But 6 months later, we're still in the same position. And what you then worry about, right, is the impact this is having on the rest of the team. Like, are we potentially going to lose some of our other engineers because they're having to do the extra hours and the extra work? So I've never actually been in a situation where I've had a manager come to me and said, this person's not working. I'm usually, I like to feel we're going through performance reviews at the moment, right? And I have a love-hate relationship with performance reviews because I think that, I meet the people I work with every single week and the performance is reviewed on an ongoing basis. So at the end of the year, it's basically just going, okay, so, and I think if you walk into a performance review and you're surprised by the feedback your manager gives you, there's a problem, right? A bigger problem. Um, and and so as part of, that particular one, I've never been in a situation where a manager comes to me and says, I'm going to pick on you again, Heather. Heather's not working out. And me going, oh my God, really? I thought she was amazing. So that doesn't tend to happen because I ask the managers every single week, is there anything I should know? Anything you're concerned about? Anything I can help with? Um, so yeah, I'm fortunate enough I've never been surprised in that way.
Yeah, well, you say fortunate, but it's obviously something that you're implementing that doesn't happen because I use it as an example, but that isn't an ideal scenario really for you to just be oblivious that something's not working to the point where someone has to come to you and let you know. So yeah, so that's good. That's a good answer.
It is. I mean, I say to my managers, right, I don't ever want to be surprised, right? So never let me be in a situation, a meeting where somebody is saying, oh, and your team didn't, or this person didn't. Like, I want to be the first person to know. Even if it's bad news, we'll manage it together. But don't ever let me be in a position where I cannot either defend your actions or explain your actions, where I'm literally sitting there with my mouth open going, okay, right. And I'm very, very clear on that. I even say it to my kids, right? I have said to them, if you murder somebody, tell me, I'll help you bury the body and then we'll figure it out, right? But don't ever let a policeman knock on the door to tell me you've murdered a body. And because you can't manage things, right, if you're coming after the fact. So managing people's expectations by having the knowledge, that's the best approach for me anyway. Everyone has a different management style, but that's what works for me.
No, I think that's a really good outlook, to be fair. I think especially when it comes to how are you supposed to mitigate damage when you're oblivious. Like it's not, and that's literally a part of your job is to kind of, I hate this phrase, but like put out fires, so to speak, and things like that. And like kind of, but if you're oblivious to the fire and the fire's in a different building in a different county and no one's told you about it, there's not a lot you can do about it from where you are.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah, you need someone to come and run and tell you that there's a fire, I guess. So but I also love I prefer your analogy to burying a body, actually. I think that's much better. I think if my mum ever said you're okay to murder somebody and I'll help you, I'd be like, right.
No, 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 hang on. I never said they were
No, I'm
okay
kidding,
to
I'm kidding.
murder somebody. I said if they did, obviously I'd help them bury the body because they're
No,
my kids and I love them, even if they have murdered someone.
no, I get it. I was just kidding. And so in terms of, I'm going to completely do a little 180 on kind of what we're talking about, or maybe not so much actually. So I'm not sure like how many women you have working on your team or anything like that, but we chatted like super briefly about it in our conversation last time off air. So I just kind of wanted to bring it up again a little bit about getting into tech, because your experience of getting into tech is, would you say, let's, for lack of a better phrase, maybe like not the usual way of getting into it, I suppose, like in terms of
Accidental would be a
accidental.
polite
Yeah, that's
term. Yeah,
perfect.
yeah,
Perfect. Yeah. So,
yeah.
but there's a lot of women out there who do really want to get into tech, or maybe aren't getting those doors opened, or who aren't, who don't have those empathetic managers like you had. And I think, and it's not, we don't need to necessarily deep dive into it or anything like that, but it is something that's important for me to talk about, because I always love when I have kind of senior engineering leaders on the podcast who are women, because it almost feels like, I'd say probably a lot of my guests are female, and every time women in tech comes up and saying that there's not enough, or there's not this, or there's not that, it's almost jarring, because I have a lot of guests on the podcast who are female and are in tech, and but often when this subject comes up, there's always this kind of elephant in the room with it of like, yeah, there's almost like a stigma or a negativity around talking about it, because it's just not in a place where you can say, yeah, everything's great for women in tech right now, or yeah, no woman's ever had any obstacles getting into tech, or it's not something that you can kind of just pass over, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase. But in terms of the tech industry on a whole, and this is a super vague question that I'm going to put to you now as well, properly put
Okay.
you on the spot, but in the tech industry, like what can the industry do generally to enable women to get into tech easier? Because I think, I don't know whether you've seen or you've got any examples of kind of seeing women try and get into tech, or kind of, if you've got anyone on your team who maybe had different struggles, or who's, and what's it like once you're kind of in that position as well? And do you see something that maybe isn't occurring in other industries as a woman, or?
It's kind of a hard question. Thanks, Heather. So obviously, right, I think at the moment about 26% of the tech workforce globally are women. And it's not awful, okay? I mean, if you were to look at the education sector, maybe less than 26% of teachers are male, right? Or if you were to look at nursing, I do think certain industries just naturally lend themselves to one gender over the other. What would bother me is if a woman did want to get into tech and felt unable to do so, right? If we're blocking that. But there are things that you can do, right? We have a female engineer, and I'm going to name her Carly Decor. She's amazing, right? But she was a marketing manager, quite senior, lots of experience, and she decided no, she wanted to get into engineering. So she did a boot camp. And she came into Typeform, and she's just fabulous, right? She's fantastic. So there are things that are out there that are available. I think one of the biggest kind of problems is Caroline, for an example, went from a marketing manager to a junior engineer. So obviously that's going to impact on, your pay for a start. And a lot of people aren't in a position where they can take a financial hit like that. But the boot camps are great. And there are a lot of, organizations out there who are specifically set up to support and aid women who want to get into tech. The bigger problem, I think, is 50% of women leave tech when they reach the age of 35. And that's the bigger problem to me. That to me indicates that, 35 is, and I'm making a huge generalization here, but my assumption is that's when the first or the second child has come along. And maybe, you know, childcare is so expensive, it doesn't make sense for them to continue to work. That would be true of any industry. Or maybe a tech company isn't offering them the flexibility that they might need. Your kid might have childcare until lunchtime, you need to collect them. Like, it's really hard balancing motherhood and work, full stop. Full stop. I have the greatest admiration and respect for anyone who chooses to stay at home. I tried it, I last 6 months. And I was proud of myself for lasting 6 months, because it's a much harder job to be at home with young children than it is to go to work. But if a woman is choosing to go to work, I think we have a duty to give them the flexibility they need. So there's a couple of things, right? In Typeform, I introduced, well, with Gordon, we introduced what we call async Fridays. So we don't have any meetings on Fridays. Okay. In an ideal world, I was actually looking at my calendar for tomorrow earlier today, and I have 3 meetings tomorrow, but that's okay, because, you know, there are reasons why. But the majority of the technology or function within Typeform will not have any meetings tomorrow. And so that's the day where you can do your laundry, right? Because you don't have to jump from one meeting to another. The other thing is, when you're coding, there is nothing worse than when you're in the zone and you have a meeting, and it takes so long to get back to that after the meeting. But sorry, I'm meandering off the point. I think we need to be supportive, you know, and we need to give flexibility. My a company I worked with previously had step away days, right? Where, you know, just every quarter they gave you an extra day around a holiday. And so you could plan around step away days. And there are other things out there. I actually spoke to an Irish company last week. I'm not going to try and pronounce their name because I know I'll mangle it, but they actually partner with companies to give childcare. And so I think if we're really serious about supporting women in technology, and why wouldn't we be serious about it, we need to look at the bigger picture, because women rarely leave tech because they hate the job. They're leaving tech because there's other circumstances, which means they just can't stay in the role. So does that answer your question?
It
I realized I
definitely
rambled a bit in the middle.
not at all. Like, it 100% covered it. It's an interesting. Well, we have like another example there. We have duvet days here at Amicus as well, where it's like an extra holiday once a quarter, and you can literally just put it in on the system. You don't have to message anyone. You don't have to do anything. You just press a button, and you're like, today's my duvet day. No one asks any questions. And it's great. Like, sometimes you can use it even if you just hung over or something, and you're just like, nah, today's not the day.
Not today. Today's not the morning. Yeah, I get it.
And it's usually, there's quite an empty office after some work socials. Sometimes there's a lot of duvet days on the system, but yeah, it's super important. That's not obviously necessarily being with a woman, but I think it's such a, and I do like to, it's kind of striking a balance as well as a podcast host, to kind of bring that kind of question up with every female and like a senior engineer that comes on, just because it isn't something that I want to kind of pry with, or I don't want to put everyone on the spot, but who else to hear it from that's, you know, kind of got better experience, right, and who can empathize with it more. And you don't necessarily want to always hear from a male perspective about what should be done about women in a certain industry. So that's why I bring that up, and I think it's super important and very, very, very helpful insight, I think. But again, you kind of mentioned a lot of your flexibility and your empathy and things like that, and I think those aren't traits that kind of male leaders can't have, you know, like that's they're not inaccessible to
No, I
anybody,
mean,
really.
yeah, I work with a team of guys at the moment, and every single one of them has empathy in spades. I'm really fortunate, and you know, I've worked with some really amazing leaders and mentors throughout my career, and the majority of them have been really empathetic. I have to say, though, I do think that if a male leader has children, it does help, right? Because they're also going through the struggles of, oh my God, the kid is sick and somebody has to stay home. And, you know, so they tend to understand better. It's really interesting watching some of my male peers transition from, you know, into fatherhood and seeing the, Oh, okay. Do you know the realization? Because genuinely, I remember when I was pregnant and somebody was telling me, oh, your life is going to change and all this. And I was like, they don't know what they're talking about, right? Their life changed, but I've got this. It's going to be fine. The kid will just slot in. Oh my God, how naive was I? Kids don't slot into anything, absolutely anything. So yeah, I
No.
think sometimes it's something you have to experience to fully understand.
Yeah, no, that's something that you definitely hear quite a lot when you chat about this kind of thing. You do kind of have to go through it. And I love what you mean about that transition into fatherhood. Like we see it quite a bit in our office. Like there's a lot of the lads in here are kind of at that stage in their life where there's a lot of, engagements and marriages and children first just being born. We've got a few newborns in the office. And it's really interesting. Kind of 1 month they'll be absolutely fine, out for drinks with the work lot, and then kind of a few weeks later or a few months later they're looking a little bit tired and they're kind of looking a little bit more stressed at work, and it's kind of like but then
Frazzled.
everyone kind of steps in to support that as well. And
Yeah.
as a father, it's it's not necessarily easier or harder than the mother, but I think I do think that guys get a bit of a tougher deal when it comes to paternity leave, but that's probably not for now. So yeah.
Different day's conversation, Heather, I think.
Exactly. We're gonna have to
Yes.
have a round two on this, I think, and just talk about paternity leave. So, I was gonna ask you like how you trust building a team. I think we've kind of covered that a lot. But is the kind of I just kind of want to go over obviously again your experiences. I absolutely love your kind of the way that you talked about how you got into tech overall. I love your outlook on it, and I love your managerial style. I think it's great, and it sounds like anybody would be lucky to have you as their leader.
Oh
In
God,
terms of
thank you.
building trust, that's all right. In terms of building trust in your team, is there anything that we didn't cover yet in terms of kind of what kind of key points? Because my next question, which will be my last question, is actually going to be what advice would you have for someone who wanted to either be a leader similar to you or is just trying to climb up the ladder, who probably should hit some key, I mean, empathy is obviously one that we've talked about quite a lot.
Yeah.
What kind of key traits would you recommend someone to have to kind of be able to climb the ladder in tech and to be able to be a really good leader in tech?
Yeah. It's a great question. I knew you were going to ask me this. So actually, I went to one of my engineering managers, and I was like, it's a hard question to ask somebody, right?
Yeah.
If you think I'm a good leader, why do you think I'm a good leader? Right? It's a weird question. But Jess is fantastic. She's my only female engineering manager. So she said one of the things that I always do is I'm really transparent. Okay. And I'm very direct. Which a lot of people might not appreciate, but I do think the transparency is key. I have worked for managers before and it's all kind of very secretive and I know more than you because I'm very important and all of that. I don't buy into that at all. And so I do monthly Ask Me Anything sessions with each of the teams, and I basically spend the first 5 minutes going, I'm going to tell you, company information that I think you should know and that I can actually share. And I always say to them, ask me questions, and if it's appropriate and I have the answers, I will answer them. So I think transparency is key, but we already talked about communication, right? You have to be able to communicate. And I know some managers who manage up really well, but don't manage down well. Because they're so busy making themselves look good to their senior management, they forget that they also need to support the teams that work for them. For me, it's the reverse is true nearly. You need to over index on the teams that work for you. As I say, I measure my success based on how successful the teams are. I also think lead by example, right? I mean, I used to, in my last company, we would have incidents where, I remember once ringing an engineer Friday night at 8 o'clock, because we had a massive issue live in production. And he said to me after the fact, as soon as he saw it was me ringing, he picked up his car keys and he started walking to the car because he didn't bring his laptop home with him. And he knew there was only one reason I would be ringing him at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, that there was going to be a massive problem. And he was already driving to work when he answered the call. And not that I could help, but I also drove to work. just to be there beside him. I did order him pizza. And if you can't physically be there, right, be there on Slack. Is there anything I can do to help? Are you doing okay? Have you taken a break? Trust, massive, right? Trust the people that are working for you. Trust that when they tell you we're going to get this done, that they will get it done. And if they don't, then you can intervene. But starting a relationship with somebody by going, well, I don't believe you, I mean, that's not going to work, right? That's not going to be productive. So for me, it's those three things, right? I would also never ask somebody to do something I'm not willing to do myself. So, if I had to ask somebody to work this weekend, I will also be working the weekend. Okay. I would never expect anyone to do anything I'm not willing to do myself, because what holds them to a different standard than myself? Now, these are how I do things, right? And as you've already said, I didn't come through a normal kind of career trajectory. And some of this I have just decided works for me. But the other thing is you can learn so much by working with other people, right? As I mentioned, I'm part of a team of 7, the tech, and I have learned so much from the other 6 that I work with. And it's okay, right? It's okay to say, oh, I really like how you're doing that, so I'm going to steal that idea. Just make sure you give them credit, right? Don't always make sure people get recognition for the work they've done. One of my biggest bugbears is people taking credit for other people's work. We have this thing that we set up a lean community in Typeform to support the women within technology. And one of the things we said is we want to lift each other up, not step on each other to get where we want to go. And I love that. So
Yeah.
there you go. Sorry, another long-winded answer, Heather.
You need to stop apologizing for these really insightful answers. Like I said it before, I remember when we chatted a little on Friday, kind of said, oh, like you can go off track sometimes. And I was like, that is music to a podcast host ears. Like, what do you mean you want to keep talking? Like go for it. Like that's great. There's some really great stuff in there that you just said, particularly about kind of the trust. I know I keep kind of coming back to this trust and empathy, but they are so key, and it's I don't really understand where a manager would expect to go without those kind of aspects, and communication obviously is a huge one. And not doing something not asking someone to do that you wouldn't do yourself is it's so obvious, right? But it's actually it's so critical to having that influence on somebody, I think, when it comes to actually how someone is going to view you and how somebody's going to, and if you don't trust them to do the job, then you ask them to do something that you just wouldn't be bothered to do yourself, like going in on the weekend or work a bit of overtime. And like you said, what standard do they have where you're holding them to account? Are you trying to make them like work harder to kind of prove something, or what's the deal with that? Like, there's no need to do that, right, as a manager. So I totally get that. And honestly, I do feel like there's a bunch of things I would love to keep chatting with you about. So we might have to do a part 2 with you, Susan, because it's honestly been absolutely class chatting with you. There's just so many things that we've covered, and I remember thinking at the beginning in my notes, I was thinking we got so much to cover in this episode, and we're going to keep it within an hour. But I actually think that there's double the amount of time that we could have had, and we could have kept going on. But I will round this one up, I promise, just so we can definitely come back and cover loads more. And but yeah, it's been absolutely. I knew it was going to be a good one, to be fair, when we chatted. I think our introduction call was probably one of the funniest that I've had. Yeah, so it was. And when you said no meetings as well, and we were chatting on a Friday afternoon, I was like, you know what, I'm okay with no meetings on a Friday afternoon. If all the meetings could be like this, I'm okay with it. So yeah,
that's really sweet.
that's
Thank you,
okay.
Heather.
No, that's absolutely sound. That's grand. So, remember, if you are watching on Spotify or YouTube or wherever you're listening, hit subscribe. You can listen to more episodes on Amazon, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, or just wherever you're listening right now. That's fine as well, because we're on there, obviously. For more from us as well, head to amicusjobs.com. Susan, thank you so much again for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Heather.